is my belief that in the next 5 years, a middle-sized country will have introduced the citizen's basic income. So perhaps Brazil will be this nation. But the word now is with you, Philip, please.
Yes, so you referred to that other important moment for the progress towards a basic income in Brazil, which was this signing of the law, of the Suplicy law, on the 8th of January 2004. I was there and I was very honored to be there, and I made a little speech insisting on the importance of that event, not just for Brazil, but in fact for the whole world. And in the whole discussion about basic income, that event has often been mentioned. Had met, in fact, Fernando Henrique a few years before, but I came a second time then to Brasilia for the signing of this law. And then I thought, Eduardo has won it. So, and I proposed at the next Congress, which took place in Barcelona, I proposed, and the other members of the committee agreed, that the basic income European network should become a basic income Earth network. Don't give us sort of handouts, and so don't give us money, give us jobs. We don't want. And so, of course, that's a very important issue, that we don't want to kill work. But precisely the whole point of a basic income, and that's so difficult to get through in some circles, is that if you want at the same time all people to have access to a job, and you want to have fome zero, you want to abolish poverty, well, it's important that the means you use in order to abolish poverty should not be just targeted at the poor, because if you target it at the poor, then as soon as they become a bit less poor, you withdraw this benefit that is given to them, as is the case in all the social assistance systems. So that it's, and what the constant effort made by basic income supporters consists in saying, no, and the right to an income is not an alternative to the right to work. It is meant to help everyone and to get access to a meaningful job.
In the National Congress, it was formed in the year 2019, the Frente Parlamentar em Defesa da Renda Básica, the parliamentary front in favor of the basic income, with 220 members of the parliament, both federal deputies and senators. So I believe that our objective is becoming more and more near to happen.
Free society, it's you make people free, not just by giving them rights, but by giving them the real possibility to choose their lives rather than be forced to accept a shitty job, a lousy job.
Can I start? Okay. So, hi everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. My name is Fernando Freitas, research on Maricá Basic Income Evaluation and PhD students in economics at UF. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to the Universal Basic Income Workshop. For those of you who haven't been with us in previous sessions yesterday, I hope you are having as much as a good time as we are. This is our fifth panel. We discussed the basic income experiments in Finland, and here we have Professor Olli Kangas from University of Turku, Finland, and Professor Jurgen de Wispelaere from Stockholm School of Economics in Riga, Latvia. Before I begin, a couple of housekeeping items. So for the schedule, we have 90 minutes for this panel, and this is how we're going to use them. First, we're gonna have around 35 to 40 minutes for Olli's presentation. Then 15 to 20 minutes for Jurgen comments. And for the presenters, when you're a presenter, I'll let you know in the chats when you have 5 minutes left of your time. But don't worry too much on this time. After this, we have half an hour for questions and debates. So for questions, the audience is welcome to ask their questions out loud in Portuguese or English. And each participant will have around 30 seconds to ask their questions. I only ask that whoever wants to ask an oral question, please let us know in the chats. And of course, you can also write down your question in the chats in Portuguese or English, and we just translate it and say it for the presenters. Thank you. Now I pass the word to Olli.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this meeting. And my title is about Finnish basic income experiment. And I will first say something about the design and some preliminary results that we have gotten. Preliminary results, therefore, that there is very, very much to do. We have done lots of analysis, but we have not done yet everything properly. So in the Finnish case, we have lots of registers, and we can put registers together with those surveys that we have conducted, and it gives us extremely good possibilities to say something very, very strongly about the effects of basic income, so that by combining surveys and registers and different kind of registers together, we can have very strong causal consequences from the experiment. The content of the presentation, I was the leader of the planning of the experiment, and then suddenly I found that I'm also the implementator of the experiment, in that way that it was planned that ministers will take over and ministries and ministers will take over, but suddenly I was the guy who was trying to run everything together and to get the experiment implemented. So that in the very beginning we have inspiration. We thought that, okay, we have possibilities to plan the best ever experiment in the world. But pretty soon we came from the skies to the ashes, and we found that there are lots of different kind of political and different kind of bureaucratic hurdles and problems that we have to solve, and there were lots of compromises. And Jurgen has sometimes said that planning this kind of experiment is an art of compromising, and it was really so all the way. So that there were very much compromises that we had to do. And therefore, in the very end, we ended up to some extent in desperation, so that the experiment was not that kind of experiment that we had visit for, but anyway, we were very happy that we could implement and we could get through something. And I think that there is something also to learn, both from the making of the experiment, our failures and successes, but also something learned from our results. Background in the experiment is that in 2015, Finland got a center-right government, and strangely enough, that government, where we had two parties that were openly against basic income, and one party, center party, that has a lukewarm relationship to basic income, wanted to have this kind of experimentation. So that it was one can say that it was a kind of wrong government that wanted to have this experiment. In the case that it had been Greens and the left-wing party, the most eager proponents of basic income in this country. In that case, I would say that the right parties had started the experiment, but in this case, somehow I would say that wrong parties started the experiment. But nevertheless, they wanted to, or they referred to changes in labor markets. That if the present social security that we have here in this country, if it somehow corresponds to those problems that we have in digital economy and problems that we have in platform economy and employment. Because most social security in this country, it's planned during the industrial area and for the industrial workers. And elimination of incentive traps. In Finland, we have lots of cases where work doesn't pay enough, so that we have income tested and means tested programs that are paid on top of each other. And in some cases, the effective tax rate, marginal tax rate can be something like 85, even more than 100% if you take into consideration, for example, childcare benefits, childcare fees that the person have or the families have to pay if they put their children in daycare. And the Finnish social security is rather comprehensive, but it's also rather bureaucratic because we have lots of programs for everything and for everybody. And then if people are moving from this scheme to that scheme, if they are sick and then they, or if they are unemployed and then they became sick, then they are moving from a scheme to another, and they are different kind of problems, and people are a little bit confused what will happen with them in those different transition phases. And therefore, the government wanted to see if basic income is good for eliminating bureaucracy and somehow to decrease those bureaucratic problems that we have here. And we had on the table 4 different models: full basic income that had been something like 1,500 euros a month. And then we did lots of different kind of micro simulations. And pretty soon we realized that it would not be possible to experiment with that kind of model because the tax rates would be rather high if we had implemented the model for the whole population, and if the model had been financed through income taxes collected on income coming on top of basic income. In that case, the tax rates had been something like 70–80%. And we pretty soon realized that if we go out with that kind of model and say that we should experiment with that kind of model, all parties would say that no way, it will not have this kind of experimentation at all, because it's unrealistic. Then we had ideas to test negative income tax, and we did lots of micro simulations also on the basis of negative income tax. But the problem in the implementation of that kind of experimentation and experiment had been that in that time we didn't have a proper income register in this country. Income register was functioning at annual basis, and we had an annual income on the basis of calculations. But in order to work properly, we should have income for at least for monthly level. Nowadays, we have it from the beginning of 2019. We have had the income register that works on daily basis, so that now it would be possible to experiment with that kind of negative income tax. But in the final end, according to our micro simulations, differences between basic income and negative income tax when it comes to distribution, income distribution, and poverty and income inequality consequences are rather the same. Basic principles are totally different, but the consequences are rather much the same. And then other models, that kind of Anthony Atkinson's participation income, something extra is paid in the case that somebody does something that is regarded as valuable work in society. But pretty soon we realized that that's impossible for us. It's impossible for us to screen what people are doing and value how much we should pay for this and that kind of work, and which kind of work is valuable enough to be paid for. And therefore, at the end of the day, we ended up modeling basic or partial basic income, and the level had been something like 550, 600 or 650 euros a month. And I will tell you a little bit later why that level was chosen. In the very it's the obligatory experiment in order to avoid selection bias. So that if you start the experiment, then everybody who will be chosen or in the sample must participate in the experiment to the end of the experiment. And then we had an idea that the whole population, excluding pensioners, should be used for the sampling. And we thought that there should be mostly low-income earners who are taken in, and then we should somehow have a weighted sample or interesting group like self-employed, small-scale entrepreneurs, platform workers, artists, and that kind of people who are not in that kind of usual employment contracts as, for example, industrial workers are. And the nation level randomization was preferred to get representative results for the whole country. And then we had ideas that there should be local experiment, for example, in some municipalities to somehow take into consideration interaction effects and networking effects in those municipalities and local effects. And then we had also ideas that following those experiments that they had in the States in 70s, 80s, that there are different levels of benefits and different tax rates in order to get idea how the benefit levels and how different levels of taxes affect people's behavior. And then what was good in that inspiration phase was that when I met the government and the Prime Minister said that you are employed by the Social Insurance Institution of Finland and they are paying out benefits of 15 billions. So that you can change the payment system so that you can mimic that those payments are basic income. And when I came from that meeting with the Prime Minister, I went to my buddies and said to my colleagues that, okay, now we are masters of the universe and we will do tricks that nobody else have ever done. But pretty soon when I went with those grand ideas to the Ministry of Social Affairs, those bureaucrats took me down pretty soon at "Hui hi, you silly boy. There are no possibilities whatsoever to do it that way." And I said that, but the Prime Minister said that I can do. He's also a silly boy. Don't believe what he's saying. So we got only 20 millions that the government promised to us for the experiment instead of 70 millions that we had hoped for, or 40 millions. And also we tried to get some extra funding, at least extra funding of 10 millions, but it failed. And therefore we had to be satisfied with that 20 millions that the government gave to us. And then, as I said, there were lots of compromises, lots of bureaucratic compromises, meeting with politicians, meeting with the bureaucrats in Social Security Administration, and meeting with bureaucrats in tax authorities. And therefore, the final setting of the experiment was very, very different from that what we had hoped for. And as I said, that planning this kind of experiment is an art of compromising, and we had to do lots of compromises at all different aspects dealing with our experiment. So that the 560 euros net a month. It's about the same level what the people getting basic security benefits, for example, basic unemployment benefit in Finland are getting. And then we had an idea to have specific tax rates and tax module implemented in the experimentation, but the tax authorities, they said that they have no possibility whatsoever to do that in the time the government gave to us. So that we had the extreme time pressure of trying to get everything done. And because it was an obligatory experiment, we had to write a legislation for the experiment. And usually writing a legislation and passing it in parliament, it takes something like 1 year. And we had something less than half a year to write the legislation and pass it in the parliament. So that there was a huge time pressure, and we tried to say to the parliament, to the prime minister and the government that instead of starting in 2017, let's start in 2018, so that we have possibilities to plan it properly and implement it properly. But they said that no, the experiment will start in 2017 and it will end 2018, because we had the elections 2019, and the government wanted to have this done before the elections so that they could use results from this experiment in the election rally. Okay, so that 506 years was it was not taken away. People could keep it if she or he found employment or not. And income coming on top of that, it was floating on to pay basic income. And then instead of having all kind of people, the final sampling was 2,000 unemployed people who were getting flat rate basic unemployment benefit from a social insurance institution, Kela. That was my employer at the time. And the reason why unemployed persons, as I said, that we were in an extreme time pressure, and the guys who were writing the laws, and when we were communicating with them, they said that it's impossible in the given time frame to write legislation for all kind of people, so that it's easier to take one single group and write legislation for that group. And we don't need to take into consideration the whole range of Finnish population and all possible social situations what they have, and write legislation for those specific cases. So that that was reason why 2,000 unemployed persons. And then one extra reason for taking those people who were getting basic unemployment benefits from Kela was that as long as they were unemployed, we could use the money paid by Kela as a basic income, so that the Kela financed part of our experiment. And in that moment, when the unemployed person found an employment, in that case, we began to pay basic income from the experimentation budget, so that in that case, we could, instead of having 1,000 persons, we could expand the number of people to be 2,000 persons. So that there was a random sampling of those people, and then the rest of people who were in the registers of Kela, they formed the control group, so that we had the experimentation group and control group, or the treatment group and control group, that in the beginning of the experiment were totally identical. And as I said already in the introduction, there will be lots of follow-up studies, registers on income employment, and also it's possible to combine the use of medicine and different kind of health registers together, so that we can evaluate if the health status among those who were getting basic income was better than among those who were not getting basic income. And also we ran surveys and face-to-face interviews and tried to get data on well-being and experiences of bureaucracy, and a kind of phenomenological side of the whole process. And then what I think is interesting in the Finnish experimentation, and I have not seen that much discussion of that in the context of some other basic income experiments in Europe or anyway, is that what's the role of national legislation and European level of legislation. As you perhaps know, Finland is a member of the European community, and it means that it's not only national legislation that is important, but it's also the European level legislation that comes in the picture. And then when we were planning the experiment, the politicians were very eager to know if basic income is exportable benefit, meaning that if basic income is that kind of benefit, that if somebody comes to Finland and moves to, say, Estonia or some other country, if the person can take the benefit with him or her and take it from Finland to his or her home country. And we ended up with this kind of schematic presentation that one criteria is that if benefits are financed through taxes, for example, social assistance and housing allowances, in that case, there's no that kind of claim right for the claimant to say that I have paid taxes, I must have this benefit. Whereas in the case that somebody is paying social security contributions, as for example in income-related pensions, in that case, those benefits are exportable, and the European legislation comes into the picture immediately and says that the benefits must be exportable from Finland to other countries. And then if we have the higher the level of the benefit, the more it comes to the social insurance-based benefits, meaning the higher the benefit, the more probable is that the European level legislation comes into the picture. And therefore we decided that, okay, the 560 euros is a kind of red line as indicated in that the horizontal axis, that those benefits, if they are lower than 560 euros, in that case, the European legislation doesn't dictate anything or doesn't say anything what the basic income in Finland is. And therefore 560 euros and the basic income 10 is below that critical red line or the European level legislation involvement. But this is just an example that when we are discussing basic income in one single European country, we should then also expand it to take into consideration those wider European level ramifications. That is it possible to implement basic income in one single European country, or should it be a kind of European level thing? What Philippe Pampari, for example, sometimes has spoken about the European dividend. And then something about the results. The government wanted to know if basic income is good for employment. And in this upper panel, we have black dots that are the treatment group and circles that are the control group. And when the experiment started at the beginning of 2017, as you see, they were totally similar. There were no difference whatsoever before the experiment and 1 month after the start of the experiment. And here you can see what are the differences and what are the confidence levels. They are displayed here in the lower panel. So that you can see that in the beginning there are no differences whatsoever, but then gradually towards the end of the first year, differences began to grow, and during the second year there is difference, but the difference is not totally significant at the total group level, and the conclusion what was drawn here was that there were no major employment effects. The experiment didn't make people more employed, but the basic income didn't make them lazier and less active than the people in the control group. However, there were significant effects among those who were immigrants and among those who had families. And the reason what I see there is that immigrants and those who had families, they were younger and they were closer to the labor markets than those who were elderly, who didn't anymore have children, and perhaps the elderly people, they also had health issues and also perhaps some problems with the educational level and skill levels. And what is interesting is that in the beginning of 2018, the government introduced what was called activation model. And the activation model was a kind of stick model in that case, that the unemployed person had to show show employment, or to show that he or she has been active enough. Otherwise, the benefit was cut down. And in this specific group, it seems to be so that the basic income worked better in terms of employment than the activation model. And once again, my explanation is that if you have this specific group of people, unemployed persons getting basic benefit from Kela, they will not be helped if you take money away from them. They will be not healthier, they will not be younger, their educational level will not be higher. But in the case that you give some free money in the form of basic income, they may feel healthier and they may feel better than those in the control group that they're somehow punished by taking money from them. So that much about the employment. And then the problem with our experiment is that because we had only unemployed persons, we don't have any possibilities to study substitution effects, meaning that we can't say what would happen if somebody is employed and will get 560 euros extra. Will she or he diminish his employment or not? We can't say anything about that. But what we can say is that if basic income can help people to find employment in this specific group or not, and I explained how it was. And it seems to be so that the basic income works better than that conditional activation model in this specific group. And then we conducted a survey, and unhappily enough, the response rates among the treatment group and among the control group, they remained very, very low, as usual in this kind of survey. So that this survey is not specifically bad in that sense that the response rates are so low. Usually in most surveys that are conducted, there's a tendency with decreasing response rates. But nevertheless, there were no differences when it comes to gender, age, education, and region where people are living. But there were some differences in income, of course, because the treatment group were getting basic income, they had higher income, and perhaps also choice of income. But we used, in order to get representativeness, we used weights and weighted the data so that it should be rather close to the population that was targeted in the experimentation. Then when it comes to that bureaucracy issue, what the government wanted to know, we had a simple research question that during the last 2 years when the experiment was running, if people had too much encounters with bureaucracy, and in the Finnish case there seemed to be rather much bureaucracy in both groups, but significantly less in the treatment group, so that those who were getting basic income, they said that they had much less, significantly less feelings of bureaucracy than those who were in the control group. And also we asked that if basic income is reducing bureaucracy, dealing with accepting employment, and also there we found a significant difference between those groups in their way that those in the basic income group or treatment group said that there were less bureaucratic encounters than among the other group. And then what is very important in our lives and in society is that if we can trust in our social institutions, and we ask if people trust in social security, legal system, police, the European Union, parliament, politicians, political parties, and other people. And what is interesting is that the treatment group was also a very high trust group in all ways, so that if you compare the control group and the treatment group, there's a significant difference, very significant difference, so that the treatment group people are trusting much more in those institutions. And also the treatment group is as a role relying or trusting much more on those institutions than the Finnish unemployed people in general. So that there may be something in that. And also, when asked that if people have confidence in own future in that way that I am master in my own life and I can decide what my future will be and what I can do in my own life. And if people is confident in his or her own economic situation, I can improve by making my own choices, my economic situation, or if I can cope with the difficult life situation. And also capabilities, what Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum are very much speaking about. That, for example, if I have a capability to have a meaningful job, to improve my material level of living, and what is also important, that I have a capacity to somehow be part of my society and participate in decision making. And in all those aspects, there are significant differences between the treatment group and the control group in that way that both confidence and capabilities are higher in the treatment group than in the control group. And finally, what I try to illustrate with this picture, that is somehow like a transistor radio inside. And I use trust here as an outcome variable. It could be overall life satisfaction or happiness or whatever here, but I use trust as a proxy for everything. And if we do that kind of analysis, it would be rather similar if we had here happiness or life satisfaction or whatever. And the arrows and show how I think how the impacts goes. And the numbers here, the regression coefficients, and the higher the number, the stronger the association is. And if you now start, for example, from health here, health is very strongly associated with, or very significantly associated with trust. And of course, age is related to health, so that elderly people have weaker health and then weaker levels of trust. And then education is central in that way that those with higher education, they have better health, and the connection between education and trust goes via health. And also it goes indirectly via financial problems. Those who are well educated, they have less financial problems, and those who have financial problems, they have lower level of trust. And then side of household has a negative correlation with financial problems. If there are two persons who are earning and making money, in that case, they have less financial problems. And then when it comes to the treatment, getting basic income, it has something to do with financial problems in that way that it decreases economic problems or the level of economic problems, but also treatment reduces experiences bureaucracy, and that if people are lots of encounters with bureaucracy, it decreases their trust. And also health has something to do with bureaucracy. People with health problems, they meet more bureaucratic problems, and once again, health has association via bureaucracy. So that what I want to describe with this is that when you do a simple modeling here, for example, additional regression model, it would show that there's no impact whatsoever the treatment has no relations with whatsoever with trust, that there are lots of that kind of indirect relations that can be somehow heuristically modeled by this kind of structural equation model that takes into consideration those multi-level or multifaceted and multiple interactions that different variables have. So far, so good. So that I think that the experiment was rather strong in that sense that it was nationwide, it was randomized, and we had identical treatment and control groups, and we have excellent registers to do analysis. Ex ante, before the experiment, during the experiment, and after the experiment. So that, for example, if somebody is interested to know what will happen or what had happened with those people who were in the treatment group versus control group after 5 years of the termination of the experiment, they can somehow study it. And as I said in the introduction, it's possible to combine registers. And it's weak experiment, only unemployed persons, only 2 years, and not possible to study community effects. And also there's not a realistic tax model included. And also what was problematic from the experiment was that the government introduced activation model that was totally a different idea than the basic income. And there were no significant employment effects, as said, in some subgroups. Our conclusion is that decent level of income is necessary for employment in this group, but it's not a sufficient condition for finding employment. There must be lots of services, employment services, educational services, health services, in addition to decent level of income. And in that way, those people with specific problems can be helped. I think that despite our survey was a little small one, but if we take results from that survey and put it together with the surveys and results from other basic income experiments, I would rather strongly argue that there may be positive effects of level of well-being, level of trust, level of trust in our own possibilities, and that kind of things, so that there is that kind of enhancing and empowerment effect that, for example, Key Standing is very much speaking about, and also that freedom effect that Philippe Van Barry has very often spoken about. And in the case that you are interested in some further analysis or something written in understandable languages, not only in Finnish, and also a book on basic income experiment is coming out this summer from the Edward Elgar publishing houses. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your awesome presentation, Olli, and thank you for bringing knowledge to us, even if it's a national holiday on Finland. And I will just pass the mic to Jurgen, and then he spoke for around 15 to 20 minutes, and then we open for debate. So if you have a question, if you have a doubt, if you want to propose some kind of discussion, you can write it in the chat in Portuguese or English, and then after Jurgen's speech, we will read it out. Thank you. Go on, Jurgen.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, Fernando. First, let me start by thanking the organizers, UFF and JFI, for inviting me to participate in this. It's been really, really fascinating listening to the talks yesterday and now participating with Olli. I mean, it's been really good hanging out with Olli again. It's been too long, really. But I'm always a bit reluctant when people ask me to comment on Finland, because the Finns have this really weird thing where they speak Finnish and I don't. So one of the problems there is that, a lot of the debate is possibly happening in a way that I'm just not aware of. Now, my usual strategy of dealing with that is I go visit Finland and I buy lots of people a lot of beers and they tell me good stories. But with the pandemic, that's been a problem as well. So my usual strategies are just not that functional at the moment. So I'm saying this in case I'm talking a lot of nonsense. Olli can tell me, but please be very nice to me. There's good reasons why I might be a bit wrong here.
Jurgen, should I go and have a couple of beers here meanwhile you are speaking?
Buy yourself a beer, yes, excellent. Olli has given us really fascinating story, right? So really fascinating story how difficult and problematic it is to actually run an experiment. You start off with a great, nice idea, and then reality kicks in, and it's really, really complicated. And the Finns have done really, really hard work to do this. So what I want to do, and Olli has already shown some provisional results, and there will be more coming out, no doubt. I look forward to reading that book specifically. And I'm sure we can engage in that with, during the discussion thing. What I want to do is something slightly different. I want to focus on what role the Finnish experiment can play at the moment, right? So in, comparing it, for example, with what's happening with Marika, with some of the experiments in the US, in Kenya, you name it. So, in the context of the Congress now. Because it's important to realize that when Olli was starting, and Olli and the team was starting the Finnish experiment, this was the one thing that was happening. The world today is very different. There's a lot of these experiments have happened, have been ongoing, are finishing up. There's still a lot planned. Most recently, the Irish government has now also committed to launching a government-based, a government-run experiment, very much like the Finnish government did in the time. So this is a very different reality. And Marika, in some sense, imposes a different reality here as well, because we're now talking about at least one place that's actually implementing an actual basic income. And there's questions, whether we need more experiments or what can we do with them, and so on and so forth. So what I want to do is I want to focus on sort of three features of the Finnish experiment and kind of link them into, what we can do with them in the current debate. So the first thing to say is that the Finnish experiment is an experiment that's happening in, if you like, an advanced welfare state context. And I think it's very important to realize that, and very important to appreciate the specific challenges that you face when you introduce, or you try to think about introducing basic income in an advanced welfare state context, versus a context where either social protection has a lot more gaps borderline non-existent in some cases, or it's so the generosity is so low that people really massively need income support, so to speak, additionally, right? And it's important to realize that Finland is part of the Nordic countries, and the Nordic countries are often put forward as the gold standard when it comes to the welfare state. Part of that is a bit of a myth, and things are changing, and Olli knows this much better than me even. But still, if you look at it compared to many of the other countries where we're talking about experimenting, for sure in Finland, people are basically generally much more protected in terms of income than they are elsewhere, right? So that means when you're talking about doing an experiment or introducing basic income in that context, we're often less worried about gaps. And we're often more thinking about modalities. We're often thinking about, okay, we have all these programs already in place, but what we're thinking about is changing these programs, right? The way that these programs are operating is too bureaucratic, too paternalistic, and so on and so forth. And that's the aspect that we want to change. So that means, in a way, we can sort of think about two very different effects that a basic income can have. A basic income can have an income effect, and it can have a freedom effect. Right, and the income effect. On the one extreme, the income effect is all about people who are really very, very poor, and what the basic income does, it literally just puts that income floor in there, right? And for example, yesterday we were talking about the Kenya experiment. I think that's a clear case of when you experiment with basic income in Kenya, you're just giving people an amount of money that's going to have a major impact. In an advanced welfare state context, I think a lot of what's happening there is about the freedom effect. These are people who are often getting income from various sources, but what we're really interested in is, playing around with the unconditionality, trying to make things less controlling, less bureaucratic, and so on and so forth. And of course, as always, the reality is that both of these effects are playing. But in general, when we're talking about sort of advanced welfare state context, that freedom part becomes really, really important, right? So going on then, one of the things to realize in this advanced welfare state context is that you're introducing basic income in a very complex social protection environment. There's a lot of existing institutions, there's a lot of existing programs, and inserting basic income means understanding basic income, interacting with all these programs. And that gets complicated very, very fast. Every interaction with another program, it's almost like an exponential complexity, if you like, right? So there's a couple of problems around that. Much of the basic income debate is always about we need to protect against, say, getting rid of programs, or we need to carefully think about which programs can be reduced, yes or no. So that's part of the debate, right? That's absolutely right. But I want to focus on another angle as well. And I think, I'll get to sort of the Finnish experiment with that in a minute. There's another aspect to this interaction debate, and this is thinking of basic income as, an unconditional freedom promoting device, but then thinking about how that interacts with a social protection environment, which may be very, very different. So here's the situation. If you are a person in an advanced welfare state who gets part of their support, their income support, from a basic income, but part of its income support, your income support, from a different set of program, which can be highly conditional. It can impose strict conditions in terms of work. It can be very means tested and so on and so forth. Then you have two different things going on in your life. You have a layer, so to speak, that is unconditional, that is freedom promoting, but you have a layer which is nevertheless very, very important, that is counteracting this. So what I want to get at basically is that when we're thinking basic income, both experimenting and reality policy, when we're thinking about basic income in this advanced welfare state context, we need to really think not just about the basic income itself, but is there a sense in which these other supporting programs also have to be made more unconditional in order to support the basic income, right? So you can again imagine sort of two very different scenarios. On the one hand, you have a basic income ecosystem where you have the basic income itself, And you have other assistance programs, whether this is housing or social insurance, or sorry, unemployment insurance or social assistance or disability benefits, student support. Think of all these things, right? They can be made semi-unconditional or very weakly conditional. And there you have an ecosystem that is very high performing on the freedom component, if you like, right? On the Freeman promotion. And on the other side, you can imagine a scenario where basically, yes, you have your basic income, which is unconditional, but these other programs remain very, very high conditional, et cetera, et cetera. And the effect of that is basically going to be that in many, many ways, it just erodes the freedom effect you're going to get from a basic income, right? Last week, I actually participated in an event in Canada, which was the annual conference of the student financial aid administrators, basically the people who in universities are, dealing with student support. And they were telling me that over the past couple of years, student support has become much, much more conditional. So they're interested in basic income. But introducing basic income there, and at the same time, all the other student support remains very, very conditional. I mean, that's problematic. It's going to clash, right? So this is, in some sense, my point here is that we need to think of basic income in advanced welfare states in a much, much broader context. And kind of coming back to the Finnish experiment, and this is partly a question to Olli. So one of the things I've heard a lot about the Finnish experiment is sort of a headline claim where people were saying, well, one of the effects of the Finnish experiment was that people are still using all these services. And many people seem to suggest that that means that in some sense, basic income is irrelevant. Because, if people still want to use all these services, then, why do we bother with that? But then the question is, if a lot of recipients, and they, many of the recipients are having the basic income, but also having access to other types of benefits. If these other benefits are more conditional, are imposing all sorts of sanctions and criteria and so on and so forth, to what extent do we really, really understand the voluntariness of people's sort of joining in terms of these services, right? So that's the sort of challenges I think that we need to think about when we're talking about basic income in an advanced welfare state context. So second point about the Finnish experiment. So first key feature, the Finnish experiment happened in an advanced welfare state context, which can be very different from many other countries that are keen on experimenting. The second one is, I want to pick up on something that Olli mentioned, and actually in the past has emphasized a lot more, which is that Finland is the first, and I think still only country that has this nationwide randomized controlled trial feature, right? Okay, and there's very good reasons for that. Olli explained this. I mean, there were very, very good reasons why this was the way to go, given the specifics of the Finnish context. But it's important to realize that, that type of unique design does come with important drawbacks, So the first one, of course, is the fact that, you really reduce any possibility to thinking in terms of community effects, right? And we, and Olli mentioned this himself already, so I can be very, very brief on this. When we're thinking about employment, for example, I mean, there's some evidence now that, employment community effects really are important. So David Kalnitsky, for example, in Canada, has been reinvestigating the Minkom experiment and has found that, in the Minkom case, which was, like a saturation site type of experiment in Dauphin, that there, employers were really reacting in a very clear sense to the introduction of Minkom, right? So there you can start thinking in terms of community effects because, the recipients interact with each other, but there's also clear interaction between the demand and the supply side of the labor market and so on and so forth. So you do a nationwide RCT, I mean, that totally disappears, right? I want to raise another question, and this is much more specific to the Finnish experiment. So this is about the implementation of the basic income experiment, given that this is happening in this nationwide RCT context. So I have a PhD student, Antti Halmetoja, who Olli knows, who's now looking into this issue. And what he's looking at is the following. He seems to have discovered some evidence to suggest that some of the recipients in the basic income experiments didn't really fully realize or understand that they were in a basic income trial, meaning they didn't fully understand what it means to have a basic income for 2 years, and especially in relation to, you know, the fact that this means no obligations and so on and so forth. And in addition to that, and this is a key point on the implementation side, he also seems to have found some evidence to, and this is very much early days, very much ongoing, right? So I'm kind of tossing this out here. He seems to have found some evidence that many of the street level bureaucrats, the people dealing with these recipients, either didn't fully understand what was going on either, or didn't realize that the person in front of them was a basic income recipient and therefore should be exempted, so to speak, from some of these criteria. And so one of the things that seemed to have happened is that these people were regularly still told that they had to sign off to all the requirements, whether this was associated with, I guess, unemployment insurance or maybe housing benefits. I'm not entirely clear of the specifics here. But the general point is that if you have something like an RCT nationwide type of scenario, and you know, at the end of the day, we're only talking about the treatment group of 2,000. That's not that large, right? Inevitably, you're going to have a big problem in terms of making sure that this is implemented in a very consistent way. It's a lot easier to do this if you implement basic income, you know, in a single place, so to speak. It's easier to train the street level workers. It's easier to make sure that everyone really fully understands what's going on here, right? So I think that's an aspect. And in some sense, that also means, and this is kind of a question to Olli, is like, how confident can we then be that the results of the basic income experiment in this sense really fully reflects, in some sense, you know, the experience of being part of a treatment group and being treated as being part of a treatment group, right? If you like. So I think that's something to reflect on. And I think it's an important lesson potentially for implementation later on. And then a final point. One of the really important aspects of Finland is that it's a completed program, right? And it's, you know, unlike Ontario, this is not an uninterrupted program. It's not completed because someone decided we're just done with it. I mean, this is a completed program from, you know, planning phase, implementation, and now evaluation, right? So one of the really interesting features here is that we cannot just start looking at the Finnish experiment in terms of results, but also in terms of understanding the process of it. And I think this is really important, right? So I'm one of these people who thinks that basic income experiments is not just about researching behavior or the impact of basic income, but it's also about testing out the machinery. And it's also very important, it's also about thinking about the policy and the political process of introducing a basic income. So I have 5 minutes, so that's fine. I'll be done with that, right? And in a way, I mean, a lot of the talk yesterday, for example, was very much on this research dimension. And a lot of people still think that at the end of the day, basic income experiments is all about research. And of course, on the research side, there is a lot to be said, right? I don't want to downplay that in any way. There's a lot of really interesting findings. There's a lot that we have to get right there in terms of how do we design it and so on and so forth. But if that's all we focus on, I think we're missing a critical dimension, which is that at the end of the day today, when you think about the process of trying to introduce a basic income for real, then Marika, for example, is the exception, right? A lot of people tell me and say, like, now we have Marika, clearly it demonstrates that we can have a policy, we don't need to bother with experiments. But I think that's missing the point. I mean, you know, Marika, if anything, is it's the exception that proves the general point. And the general point is that most governments, whether this is at municipal or national or who knows, regional level, most governments are very wary of simply introducing a basic income. So experimenting is the best you're going to get. Now, having the commitments to do a basic income experiment is no guarantee that at the end a basic income will emerge. And actually, Finland is evidence of that, right? So, I mean, you know, we have had the Finnish experiments. It ran the way it ran. We have the results. And my experience, and again, Olli might disagree with this, but my experience is that in some sense, the experiment then landed and was a bit of a dud. I mean, it seems that the debate has moved on. It seems that, the experiment's results hasn't really been picked up much. I mean, the sort of media and public excitement that we got at the beginning of the experiment was not there when the results were being introduced. It seems that, the different political parties have partly moved on, or maybe fully moved on, and now sort of considering other types of proposals, right? So there's two ways to think about that. One way is just to say, well, the results in Finland weren't really exciting enough. So, for example, on employment, as Olli was saying, in many ways, we didn't see general effects, and this confuses a lot of people. The advocates don't know what to make of it, and the critics don't know what to make of it, right? And so inevitably, you don't have a clear view whether basic income is obviously good or not. And so that means, it's sort of not exciting enough. But there's another angle to think about here, and this is kind of going back, basically linking the Finnish experiment in terms of lessons going forward. Is there a sense where perhaps the process of designing a basic income experiment and not perhaps fully linking it into the policy process, whether that could be a problem of itself? So let me give you two quick examples and then I'll end it. One positive and one negative, I think, about the Finnish experiment. I mean, the positive one, I think, is the fact that the Finnish experiment very clearly stayed within an election cycle. Right. And people often complain about the fact, and Olli also acknowledged the fact that 2 years means that we have limitations in terms of results. But it's really important to realize that if you don't stay within an election cycle, a lot of stuff can go wrong. And I just have to mention Ontario, Canada, to give you an example of what can go wrong if you start an experiment with one government, there's an election, and another government comes in, right? So this is really critical to really appreciate as part of a policy process, as part of a political process, that it's not just about what's best from the research design. It's great in Kenya that we can run things for 12 years, right? And partly that's done because they're not dependent on the government. But if you have a government-run experiment, if you see experiments as partly part of the process, then these are realities you need to keep in mind. And I think in a way Finland did that right. I think there's an important positive lesson there. In terms of a negative lesson, I think in many ways what happened in Finland is that they really decided that we're going to run this experiment in as scientific a way as possible, and we're going to almost take it out of the policy process for the duration of the experiment, and then we'll have that debate when the results are in. But in some sense, politics moves on, right? I mean, you can do that. You can do all your science. You can take the experiment out of the politics or try as much, run them, try to keep it all, hush-hush, if you like, no interference and so on. But that means you're missing a big opportunity to engage with the public, to engage with policymakers. And in the meantime, the policymakers are moving on. The politicians are moving on. And, your results are coming in, and they're coming in after 2 years of the political environment already moving on, right? And this is a problem. I mean, suddenly expecting politicians to be as excited in that sort of context, I think is problematic. So what's the bottom line here? I think this is really difficult. I think one of the biggest challenges is to try and get an experiment that satisfies both the scientific criteria, tries as optimally as possible to get a scientific experiment going, but also at the same time really keeps these opportunities and that engagement with the policy process live. And I think this is very, very complicated and very difficult. So I'm really putting that out here as a challenge. But I think it's something that we have to get right as much as possible. And in a way, I do think the Finnish experiment gives us a lesson in what can go wrong if we perhaps overestimate on one side, overemphasize on one side, and slightly forget about the other side, so to speak, right? I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you for this very provocative speech. These 3 points are very interesting. I offer the opportunity to really comment on that. just remember the 3 main points that Jurgen has pointed out. 1. The experiment was implemented in advanced welfare state contexts. So it was different than other experiments in developing countries, as well as in the form that the Finland UBI experiments interact with the existing welfare system that was very advanced and complex at the same time. 2. It was a nationwide randomized control trial without forms to measure community effects of the basic income. And 3, it's more a political question about this disalignment between the academia sides and the political sides, as meaning the political is the times of academia and politicians are very different, as well as their enthusiasm. So, go.
So thank you, Jurgen. Good points, and I very much agree with all of your points. If you start with that advanced welfare state, I would say that perhaps Finland is the country where the existing social security system is the closest in the world to basic income. So that we have universal child benefit to every child that is younger than 17 years of age. Then we have universal free grant for students that are studying. And then we have basic unemployment benefits, what we call labor market subsidy. It's payable forever, so that we don't have any upper limits in the duration. And then we have universal national pension that's available for everybody that is over 65 years, regardless of social status, regardless of work history whatsoever. And when it comes to social assistance, the last resort social security system in this country, there are comparisons between social assistance in the European community, and the Finnish one is the most liberal one of those, so that there are sanctions, so that the person who is getting who is getting social assistance, she or he must, as they say, seek employment and to be in use of labor markets. But if you don't do anything, the maximum reduction that they can do is 40%. So that 60% that is left, it can't be taken away. So that it's there, and it's a constitutional right. So that the basic income somehow is there. That's one point. And then the implementation, when we try to submerge our model in the existing social security system, then we met those legislative problems, because, as I said, that the price for the compulsory and obligatory experiment was that we must write the legislation. And when we write the legislation, then we had to encounter all possible situations. What will happen if somebody is a single person and she got married, gets child, gets sick, gets this and that and that and that. And we had to take into consideration all possible transfers and changes in social situations. And that was what I have called that it was the perspiration phase of our experiment. So that sitting there and trying to do that so that it demanded lots of perspiration. And it was not that much anymore of inspiration. And then the second point was, what was that, Fernando? It was, or Jurgen.
So you kind of covered the implementation stuff as well, I think, right? Or I mean, do you think that there's a problem with the fact that, actually no? So the second one was the implementation one, is the fact that, you know, so So Antti, I mean, he's as I said, he's going to write a paper about this. But so Antti Halmetoja basically thinks that there's been some problems in certain parts with the implementation, and that could potentially impact on how we really should understand the experiment results.
Yeah. So the problem when we were planning the experiment and when the experiment was implemented was that it seemed to be so that the government doesn't know what right hand is doing when they did something with the left hand. So that on one hand, they started this basic income experiment, and then a year later, they started with that activation model that somehow was hit in the nose of the basic income experiment. And then what happened also, and it has something to do with the fact that the bureaucrats didn't know what to say and what to, or how to, or which kind of advices to give those people, was that when the experiment started, then the government transferred social assistance from municipalities to social insurance institution, so that it was one of the biggest social security reforms in Finland that took place at the same time. So that those bureaucrats at social insurance institution, they got basic income stuff, and then they got this social assistance stuff. And they didn't know exactly how to handle with those two things. And then also the claimants could be somehow a little bit unaware if they are getting basic income and what on earth they are getting. So that's totally true. And also, what I think that what's good in that the people were using those services is that especially very many Americans, when they are asked, they seem to think that basic income is replacing in Finland, for example, social services, health services, etc., etc. They're totally two different things in this country. So that you have income transfers and then you have services, and they have not that much to do that. And the basic income has to do with the income maintenance program and guaranteeing people a decent level of income. And then they have right, precisely as they have had right to use medical services, employment services, etc., etc. So that I think that it's not only a negative thing that people were using those services and trying to get the help from for example, employment services. And then the third question was the political process. And I think that when I'm now thinking backwards what we did, and I have a feeling that one of the perhaps most important lesson is, as Jurgen said, that the process, how everything started, what we've done, and how it was mostly me who had the communication with politicians. That the minister who was responsible for this, she called me and said that could you come here and could you explain me what's happening, and let's do in this and that way, and what are your plans to do. And then she was the person who said that, okay, let's take those unemployed persons and let's start a pilot. She was speaking about pilot 2017. And she said that, okay, let's start a better experiment 2018. But then it didn't happen. And we got a new government 2019. It's led by the Social Democratic Party. And then in its governmental program, they say that we will have a new experiment. And I also participated in those negotiations when they wrote that governmental program, and they asked that which kind of experiment there should be. And they didn't, it was not my advice, it was perhaps the advice from the Minister of Finance that let's experiment with negative income tax. It's negative income tax in the Finnish version, but in the English version, they say that we will have basic income experiment. so that something is lost in translation. But anyway, Jurgen, you are totally correct that the process is very important to see that which kind of problems and hurdles there were and how the different thresholds were solved and which kind of political deals there were behind the curtains. And in this specific group experimentation, we had three ministers who were involved in the minister who was responsible for the experiment. She came from the True Finns, and there were questions about the immigrations. And True Finns is a xenophobic party, a populist party, saying that the immigrants are bad for the country, and therefore the minister was very eager to get answer to that question, that if basic income is exportable benefit or not. And she was in the very beginning skeptical. We shouldn't have this kind of experiment because it will improve the image of the country, and all refugees from Iraq will come to Finland, and when they are in Finland, they will call their cousins in Lebanon and say that come here, you will get manna from heaven. And she was skeptical, but when we discussed it, and I had lots of meetings with her, she finally said that I will take care of this experiment of ours. This is our experiment, and I will take care that it will be implemented, so that she somehow changed her opinion. But then the minister of all experimentations, she came from the Center Party, and she had different opinions. She wanted to have local experiment, what Jurgen very well described, that it had perhaps been better in that sense that we could have had that community effect and interaction effects. And then the third person who was involved was the Minister of Finance. He said that this is bullshit. We shouldn't have this kind of silly things in experimentation, because basic income is nothing, it's rubbish. So thank you, Jurgen, very good comments.
Well, thank you for this very interesting discussion. We have a brief time for discussion now. We had already a lot of questions here in the chat. Some of them you already replied in your speech. So I just asked them jointly two of them that are remaining. So one is a question of Claudia Pessoa, is that she'd like to know if this experiment has showed some kind of negative discrimination or some kind of stigma, like the beneficiaries were linked to uselessness, accommodation, or something like that, linked to the groups that are benefit for the basic income experiments in Finland. And two, Larissa Peixoto asked if there's a data on the participants' perception of their quality of life, and if we can think of a long-term results based on that.
Yes, the first question, no, there was no stigma as far as I know, so that people didn't feel any stigmatization, so that it was, so that to put it simple, no. And the second one, yes, there was effect or correlation between the recipients of basic income and level of living and level of satisfaction or life satisfaction, so that those who were getting basic income, they were more satisfied with their lives, so that it improved the level of life. And one interesting thing is that people paid much more attention to that non-significant employment effect than that positive effect on well-being. And the question is that if we have two options, one option like basic income that doesn't, in this group, that did increase a little bit employment, but not significantly, but it increased significantly well-being. And then we had the other option, the existing social security or the activation model that decreases the level of well-being without improving employment. So that why on earth to take that is not improving employment, but that it decreasing level of well-being. So that that was totally absent in the Finnish discussion. And somebody asked that what was the reaction in the Finnish discussion, and it was very much so that the disappointed results, no employment effects whatsoever. And I think that they were rather good results in their way that I think that when we are discussing basic income, we shouldn't pay that much attention to employment effects, but we should discuss much more the other effects. For example, freedom, what Veli-Pekka Pari is speaking, or empowerment, what Key Standing is speaking, etc. And those aspects were rather strong in our survey.
Fernando, could I say something on that? I mean, I remember having a conversation with you, Olli, but also with some other people. This was the year before, you know, the year that we were sort of doing the research, the background research, and designing the experiment and discussing this. And I remember asking the question, you know, like, what do you think would be the employment effects? Like, do you think we see negative effects? Do we see positive effects? And you and many other people, and myself, I was in the same, we're basically saying, actually, the most reasonable expectation is that we don't see any effects at all, because it's going to be so difficult to create an experiment that will really, really show effects, right? So in many ways, I mean, you know, you need to be very realistic. And I think this is an important point, managing the expectations of the sort of the politicians and the policymakers in terms of what could you reasonably expect from a basic income experiment is a very hard job as well, but a very, very important job, right? So,
well, we had a few questions in the chat, but there's not enough remaining time. So I just would like to thank again for this great session, this great discussion. All the academic sides, the politician aspects, it's very great to consider this in implementation of policy. And I just would like to invite for the next session that begins in 2 hours. That is the preliminary qualitative results of the evaluation of the Maricá Basic Income Program, which it happens that I will be one of the speakers with Paul and Roberta, with commentator Maximiliano Molona. The link's in the chat, so feel free to join. Thank you for everyone that has shown up, and thank you again for the presentation.
thanks. Good to see you, Olli, and enjoy your midsummer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and welcome to Finland, Jurgen, and then we will have those
Absolutely.
10 beers.
10 beers, good. That's a good reason.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, bye-bye.
Kiitos, bye-bye.
Goodbye, Jurgen. Thank you so much.
Good stuff. See you soon.
See you. Bye.
Goodbye. Foi ótimo, hein? Vocês estão fazendo uma conferência de primeira qualidade. Parabéns.
Obrigado. Parte muito importante é a participação do público, não?
Poxa, mas realmente